Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming on this beautiful day. I know we're all interested in hearing about native gardens and how they attract wildlife and pollinators. That seems to be of great interest to people. My name is Brenda Cunningham. I'm the program chair of the Salal chapter of the Washington Native Plant Society. And we have with us today Scott Logan from the Gottlieb Native Garden in California. 3 months ago or so, I was approached by garden staff about giving some programs to us or offering some programs to us, and they all sounded so interesting. Scott is going to fill us in on what he's the resident naturalist, so he's tracking the critters that have been attracted to and are resident to the native garden. And I as manager of our display garden, I'm especially interested in this because it's a big motivator for why people plant and choose native plants for their yards is to attract and host other creatures. So as you heard, the program is being recorded and it will be posted on our website to share with others later if you like. So without further ado, please welcome Scott Logan.
All right, thank you, and good morning, everybody. I think the best thing to do here is just to jump into it, and after, I'm fully willing to answer any questions, as many questions as you want, but we'll just wait till the end for those, all right? So let me get this going. All right. So I'll just give you a quick sort of overview of this garden. Geographically, it's right in the middle of Los Angeles. In fact, the view from the backyard is of downtown LA. The garden is just over an acre, and about half of that is terraced down an east-facing hillside. And as of today, I would say that the garden's flora is about 90% native. Maybe it's just over 90% native now. They're always taking out whatever non-native is left there. And although at times the garden is irrigated, the plants get very little unseasonal water and no fertilizers ever, and also no poisons or pesticides have ever been used in this garden. The way the water cycle kind of works for this garden is we get our water from, normally here in Los Angeles, from November to April. So that's when water would go on the garden, when we would have those normal rainstorms. The only other water that goes on the garden outside of that period are new plantings and some areas on the perimeter because it does butt up against chaparral, which is fire prone, and the owners of the property just want to keep some of that green. All right, so let's get into the presentation. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I've always marveled at how much wildlife can be found in a city that contains over 4 million inhabitants. LA County with over 12 million inhabitants, it's crazy to me that this wildlife lives here. But I was even more surprised to find out how diverse wildlife could be in just one urban yard. And it's a yard landscaped with California native plants. For the past 7 years as the garden's naturalist, I've been documenting wildlife that utilizes this space, as well as coordinating and participating in university-led scientific study. The Gottlieb Native Garden continues to prove without a doubt that we can begin to repair the negative effects caused by decades of urban development and support native wildlife by simply planting native plants. So you won't recognize me in this photo, but this is how I spend much of my time in the garden, literally lying in bushes with a camera, or in this case, lying in buckwheat. My subject in this shot was this large grass spider with a just captured European honeybee. Up to this point, I've been able to identify over 1,400 species of animals on this property. That would include tiny insects up to some of LA's largest mammals. Over 100 species of those are birds. Now we're up to 112 species, I believe, with a recent finding of a western screech owl. Here it is bathing at one of the lower water features. Now, a few of these species have only been one-day wonders, like these 2 Caspian terns that happen to fly over the yard. And some of these species appear in the garden only infrequently, like pine siskins. Down in here in Los Angeles, People who have Niger feeders see pine siskins from time to time, but they're very unpredictable in the lower elevations in LA County. Occasionally, these birds are really unique, like this male leucistic Allen's hummingbird. His coloration is very different than a normal male Allen's. If you compare the male that just landed at the edge of the bath, you'll notice that wherever the brown tones appear normally, those areas are white on our leucistic bird. He hung around the garden for about 3 years, and we haven't seen him now for a couple of years. Some of the bird species on our list normally reside east of the Rockies, like this white-throated sparrow that spent a winter in the garden. But probably the most lost long-distant migrant that we've documented in the garden is this chestnut-sided warbler, a species normally found in northeast coast of the United States. But the majority of the birds found in the garden are residents, like this really cheeky house wren. Another impressive list is the 27 species of mammals utilizing this one urban yard. Our latest mammal species recorded was a western mastiff bat. This brings a total of 10 confirmed bat species hunting insects over the garden's airspace. I'm currently in the vetting process of 4 other species of bats, one never documented yet in Los Angeles. If we're able to confirm all 4 of those species, we'll be up to 31 species of mammals in one garden, and I think that's kind of crazy. So the garden's ability to attract and to provide for such a wide variety of animal species has caught the attention of researchers, educators, and a broad range of environmental groups, including the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. They've done a couple of bio blitzes in the garden. National Geographic magazine has shot in the garden, and me being a photographer, this was a highlight as I got to spend 3 days with a National Geographic Society fellow, Charlie Hamilton James. The BBC has filmed in the garden, as has National Geographic Channel. And for those of you that do watch Nat Geo, almost all of the hummingbird clips shown in their programs are from this one yard. Some of the universities carrying out studies in the garden would include Loyola Marymount University, UCLA. This particular study was pretty interesting. It was on the relationship between fire and western fence lizards. Cal Poly, Occidental College. This is one of the studies that I am part of, as well as the University of California, Davis, or UC Davis. Out of all the universities that have done study in the garden, UC Davis has the longest running research program. Dr. Lisa Tell's Hummingbird Health and Conservation Program has used the garden for a study site since 2014, and I've been personally collaborating with them since 2015. Essentially, hummingbirds are captured and processed. All vitals are taken, including blood and feather samples for future DNA analysis. Even the hummingbird's weight is taken, and if you ever wondered how a hummingbird gets weighed, there it is. That's a male Anna's hummingbird in its glorious plumage. The last part of the process is to insert a tiny pit tag under the hummingbird's skin. A small incision is made to insert the tag, and then the bird is sutured up. Last, a numbered band is put on the bird's right leg, and this becomes a future visual indicator that the bird is participating in the study. After all of this, the bird is ready to be released. Six antennas placed strategically in the yard track these tagged hummingbirds. The gray ring that you see in this image is one of those antennas, and over the past 6 years, the program has banded or tagged over 1,000 hummingbirds in this one garden. As the antennas collect data, this is what it looks like. The oldest known bird in the study is now 6 years old. UC Davis's groundbreaking work on the health and social relationships of urban hummingbirds has now been published in many peer-reviewed journals, and another one is coming out shortly. So for my species documentation project, much of my identification involves photography. 2 years into my assignment, we realized that a compelling wildlife story was being captured with these images, and the seed for the next Gottlieb Native Garden book was planted. That idea became a reality with the release of the Gottlieb Native Garden, An Intimate Wildlife Journey. Most of the photos from this point forward are from this just published book. Now, I thought before we got into the photos of the animals themselves, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the techniques I get to use, that I use to get them. I like to use flash in my photography. I personally like the look and the feel of mixing different light sources when creating an image. On this afternoon, I was capturing female leafcutter bees as they were provisioning their nest with pollen for their young. If you look closely at the entrances to the tubes, you'll notice that they're different colors. Those are the hues that represent the colors of the flowers or leaves they use for capping their brood chambers. I spend a lot of time exploring at night. In this image, one of my trail cameras captured me as I checked camera settings while shooting nocturnal animals. Here's the bird that I was photographing that night, a common poorwill hunting from a cement swale. And a very interesting fact about common poorwills is it's the only known bird species in the world that truly hibernates. I also have a few passive DSLR camera traps that I continually move around the garden. It takes a great deal of time to set them up and to keep them operating. One of the problems is that wildlife loves to chew on the cables, but in the end, all the effort pays off with intimate shots like this one. These fawn siblings were no more than a day or two old. Camera traps really have the ability to capture candid moments, like this wonderful shot of me checking on a camera, sorry. This image even startled me when I first found it. But out of all the photography featured in this project, the most technically complicated and time-consuming are the focus stacked images made with live animals. This would be a typical setup, a D850 controlled by an iPad with multiple flashes. When I'm creating these images, sometimes I shoot indoors so I can control the environment. Focus stacking is basically taking multiple photos of one subject at different focal points and then stitching them all together to form an ultra sharp image. It's an amazing process that has the ability to produce highly detailed images of very small subjects. With focus stacking, you're in complete control of sharpness and depth of field, enabling you to do things that just aren't possible with normal camera settings. This happens to be an image of a Carolina sphinx moth in front of the Gottlieb's entryway to their home. So I think this is a great place to start our photographic journey. Now, as we're looking at these images, I'll ask you to please keep in mind that every animal in this presentation is from one single yard, a yard right in the middle of the metropolis of Los Angeles. Some of these animals are reclusive and difficult to find, like this ringneck snake. Others are so shy we have to all be really lucky to ever see them, like this gray fox. But the majority of these animals, like this hermit thrush, can be found all over Los Angeles. All they need is the proper habitat, and that's where native gardening comes in. Now, I do want to point out one thing about this garden. The east side of it adjoins chaparral habitat, allowing a natural entryway for species of animals that need an expanse of native habitat, like California quail and California thrasher. This is one of my favorite birds. But the majority of the animals we get in the garden, like the cedar waxwings, could end up in virtually any of our yards. We get them in the winter, and you guys, I'm sure, have them during the summer and maybe all year round. Now, many people think of European honeybees when they think of what they want their garden to support. But as the name implies, these bees are not native. They commandeer habitat like this western screech owl box and outcompete our native bees for pollen. When a honeybee swarm moves into the Gottlieb native garden, it's humanely relocated, like this hive was that took over a barn owl box. When it comes to bees, I believe we should all be focusing on the benefits of native bees, like this ligated furrow bee, or this pollen-covered Slevin cellophane bee. In Los Angeles County alone, we have over 500 species of native bees. These bees evolved with our native flora and have become expert niche pollinators. This diversity ultimately contributes to a healthy ecosystem. As of last count, I found 38 species of native bees in the garden. This digger bee is one of them. Digger bees can be really entertaining as they zigzag from flower to flower and plant to plant. And this particular bee happened to be cleaning pollen off of its tongue as it was traveling from one flower to another. Of the 38 species, 29 of them occur regularly, and many of them are extremely beautiful, like this female metallic green sweat bee. In the correct light, many species of sweat bees shimmer in metallic hues of greens, blues, and golds. Now here in Southern California, there are many plants families that I consider excellent for insect pollinators, and buckwheat, which is pictured here, is one of them. Bees aren't the only pollinators working hard in the garden. Many fly species are good pollinators too. Some of these are not only good pollinators, but they benefit the garden in other ways. Take this four-spotted aphid fly, for instance. Their young are carnivorous. Females lay eggs near aphid infestations, and once they hatch, the larvae eat large amounts of tiny pests. After flies, other beneficial pollinators would be butterflies, moths, beetles, wasps, and of course, hummingbirds. And although hummingbirds are not the best pollinators we get in the garden, they don't stop pollinating when it rains. And I guess the caveat there is when it rains, because we have not had much rain this season. Another group of insects that we all enjoy having in our gardens is butterflies. Now, I'm not sure if you guys have milkweed and you get monarchs up there. You may, you'll tell me at the end of the presentation. Down here in Southern California, people plant milkweed to attract monarchs to their yards. You do this so that the females are attracted to your yard. They'll lay eggs on it because milkweed is the host plant for their eggs, for their young. But when planting milkweed, it's very, very important to plant only native varieties. For us here in Los Angeles, it's A. fascicularis, or narrow leaf milkweed, that's pictured here. Monarchs have a much better chance for a healthy reproduction cycle when using native milkweeds. And I'd love at the end for you guys to chime in on that. And just as monarchs are attracted to milkweed, other species of butterflies have been attracted to the garden by planting host plants for their larvae. Quail bush is the host for western pygmy blue. This is one of my favorite butterflies we get in the garden. Measuring in at a mere 3/8 of an inch, they are the smallest butterfly found in North America and one of the smallest in the entire world. Butterflies and moths are not just beautiful, but they're an important part of the food chain. They lay an enormous amount of eggs, which turn into caterpillars, some of which can be huge, like this white-lined sphinx moth larva consuming a primrose flower bud. As the saying goes, if something's not eating your plants, then your garden is not part of the ecosystem. But not to worry, as most butterfly and moth larvae are very small. But whatever the size, insect larvae is an important source of foods to the animals in the garden, especially birds during breeding season. 11 species of birds have been documented nesting in the garden, including Bewick's wrens, which are pictured here. Here are two other species that regularly nest in the garden. On the left are oak titmice, is an oak titmouse, and on the right, a male Nuttall's woodpecker is feeding a chick. I can't emphasize enough how many insects are fed to baby birds. The house wren on the left has a huge centipede, and the woodpecker on the right has, I think, 5 different species of insects in that one load back to the nest. Most native plants produce food that our native animals are familiar with. Again, down here in Southern California, toyon is a huge wildlife feeding plant. When it comes to plants having the ability to support wildlife, toyon is a keystone species. Not only do birds like this western bluebird eat the berries, but toyon's flowers are great for native pollinators. Clearly, this white-banded crab spider is aware of this as it lies in wait for its next meal. Interesting note about them, they can change color between white and yellow depending on what flowers they're hunting on. Toyon is the perfect example of how wildlife prefers native over non-natives. Toyon fruit will be stripped from its branches by wildlife before ever touching the similar-looking non-native pyracantha berries, even if those plants are found directly next to each other. And this is true for seeding plants as well. This is a lesser goldfinch eating native sage seeds, and they prefer native plants over non-natives. Historically, Anna's hummingbirds were the only year-round species of hummingbird found in Los Angeles. They're connected with the rhythm of our native flowering plants, and manzanita blooms are a very important nectar source late in the year. And while on the subject of food sources, the garden has some bird feeders intended to augment the nourishment being provided by the native plants. Nectar feeders are the most abundant, with dozens of hummingbirds feeding at them at any given time. This photo was taken in July, and it shows the 3 species of hummingbirds expected in the garden during that period, and that would be Anna's hummingbird, Allen's hummingbird, and black-chinned hummingbird. And every March, like clockwork, orioles arrive to feed at their designated feeders, and they'll be filled and ready for them. The feeders are similar to hummingbird feeders, but the port that they put their beak into is larger because they are a much bigger bird. A few seed feeders are available for granivorous birds like this California scrub jay. And mealworms are popular too, especially during breeding season. This male spotted towhee is about to bring a load back to the nest. Also, I don't know if any of you noticed something in the upper right portion of this image. That's Sparky, one of Susan's cats in the cat run. These cattatrails provide an ingenious way for cats to roam the garden. Wildlife is safe from the cats, and the cats are protected from the wildlife. But I can't claim that the fish in the upper pond are safe from the wildlife. When herons come in for a meal, they are not chased off, and they're allowed to hunt without being harassed. When wildlife takes something from the yard, we simply consider it nature's tax, well worth paid. Along with food, wildlife needs a clean source of water. Here, a yellow-rumped warbler drinks early morning dew that had collected on fairy duster leaves. Water features are an excellent addition to any landscape, and the Gottlieb Native Garden has 5 of them. Not only do animals like these band-tailed pigeons drink from them, but animals bathe in them as well. The more diverse your water sources are, the more diverse the wildlife will be that uses them. Take hummingbirds, for instance. They love their baths, as foraging for nectar is a really sticky business, but they will normally only bathe in very shallow, continually moving water. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, no chemicals are ever used in this garden, and that includes the water features. And 3 of these larger water features support thriving ecosystems. And over time, these water features have become an important stop for migrating birds. Birds have an excellent memory for resources along their migratory paths, and every year, hundreds of migratory birds visit the garden. During late April, it's not uncommon to see groups of Western tanagers jockeying for position in the lower water feature. Even a stormy afternoon didn't stop these cedar waxwings from using this water source, which is basically just a depression in a rock. So many of these images have stories attached to them, but I want to stop for a moment to tell you a story about this one. So this photo was taken by one of my DSLR camera traps. Here's what the camera setup looked like. The bath is in the lower middle part of the frame. The camera is sort of middle left. I happened to be in the garden checking on my equipment when a hailstorm began. So I retreated into the Gottlieb's home to wait it out. About a half an hour later, I returned to find this amazing rainbow. It was magnificent. It arched, and the arch framed the entire garden for nearly 5 minutes. And as I sat and admired it, I noticed that hummingbirds would glow even more brilliant orange as they flew through the bands of color. It wasn't until the rainbow fully dissipated that I checked my camera trap and I found this image. Apparently, just as the storm ended, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds and a flock of cedar waxwings flew down to drink and bathe. The timing was remarkable, and luckily, my equipment functioned properly to capture the moment. And thankfully, everything performed properly for this moment as well. This is one of my favorite images captured during this project. And as you can see, it's more than birds that take advantage of these water features. Another important component of a healthy ecosystem are the predators that come as our predators, and they come in many shapes and sizes. We're familiar with spiders like this graceful green lynx spider, and praying mantises like this bordered mantis. Now, here in Los Angeles, people can purchase mantis eggs from nurseries, but I encourage people not to do it. I don't know if this is true, if this happens up in the northern part of the country too. But when you go to nurseries and buy these egg cases, they're always non-native mantises, and they're usually from Asia, and they're much bigger than our native species. What happens is they ultimately wreak more havoc in our gardens than any organic pest control than they might provide. One of the native insects to Los Angeles that we can buy here for organic pest control are green lacewings, and they may, in your garden stores, they may sell lacewing larvae also, but find out if it's native. Here they sell them during spring, and it's their eggs they sell you. Once the eggs hatch, the larvae will consume large amounts of soft-bodied insects. But lacewing larvae are just one of many small insects that make a fierce living protecting our gardens. Reptiles are a very important part of keeping an ecosystem in balance. Fence lizards would be recognized by most everyone here, and some people may have noticed that they spend a great deal of time up in trees, and this is because they're in the suborder of iguana. Small snakes like this western black-headed snake like to eat small terrestrial things like millipedes and centipedes. And to give you an idea of how small this snake is, those are scrub oak leaves on the ground. And without close inspection, it could be mistaken for a large worm. Snakes come in plus sizes too. Our largest here is the San Diego gopher snake. It is an excellent rodent hunter. These snakes are confused with rattlesnakes all the time because they will mimic rattling with a combination of vibrating their tail and hissing. Unfortunately, if it's a human that makes this misidentification, it's usually tragic for the snake. After good rainy periods, black-bellied salamanders will appear. They spend the majority of their times underground, but will venture above ground to feed and breed whenever the environment is wet enough to keep their skin moist. We went through going back 3 years, we went through a 2-year period where I did not see them. They never emerged because we didn't have enough rain. This season, we had 2 weeks of rain. I saw them at the tail end of that 2 weeks, then the rain stopped and I have not seen them since. So we only see these amphibians after really good raining periods. Many songbirds are excellent hunters, like this western kingbird, but even excellent hunters need to watch out for predators. No small bird in the garden is safe from Cooper's hawks. And I know that many of you are not happy about having these predators in your yard, but they're an important part of keeping an ecosystem in balance. Raptors range significantly in scope and size. This sharp-shinned hawk, or sharpie, is about the size of a robin. And this is the only bird in our area that I know of that can capture a hummingbird in flight, and I've seen it happen with my own eyes. On the other end of the raptor spectrum, in Southern California, the apex predator on wing is the great horned owl. They hunt a wide range of prey, and they have the ability to carry a large rabbit. And when you pack a set of talons like these, everyone gets out of your way. And when the California ground squirrel populations grow large, we see a lot more of our favorite bobcat. He happens to be tagged and collared and is known to the Park Service as B346. We simply call him Hank. Now I'm going to back this shot up for a moment and I want to show you something really interesting. Earlier in the day, before this photo was taken, the camera got photos of 2 other mammals. That's Leo the cat taking Susan for a walk in the yard. And what's telling about this image is that urban wildlife is so used to humans and domestic animals, they don't seem to care about sharing the same space with us, and in particular, sharing this trail. So breeding season in the garden is always an exciting and lively time. Animals are defining and defending territory, like this singing spotted towhee belting out his song. They're out and about collecting nesting material. This is no titmouse pulling from a cotton ball. And building homes to raise their children. Now, I watched these 2 building this nest for about an hour, and what struck me really funny is that bird that's above the nest itself didn't really ever move. It was just giving direction the whole time. And I don't know if you guys have bush tits up north, but we have this bird bush tit here, and they create these hanging nests out of soft material decorated with small bits of leaves and sticks and flowers. People find these in their bushes and wonder what the heck they are, and they happen to be a bush tit nest. Now, after all the preparation, the romance begins. And then the children appear, and sometimes loads of them. However people feel about California ground squirrels, their babies are really, really cute. Now, a magical time to tune into a garden is the period between day and night. It's that space where diurnal animals are just finishing their shift and nocturnal animals are beginning theirs. And once it's dark, I highly recommend exploring your garden to see what you can find. Yes, there'll be the usual suspects like orb spiders and moths, all of which I find extremely beautiful. I mean, the wings of moths are literally nature's canvas for elaborate tapestries. To me, the pattern on this elder moth could be used for an elegant dress. But if you simply take the time to be quiet and observe, you're sure to be amazed at what happens. Take beetles, for instance. Some species are active during the day, like this green fruit beetle, but many, many more are active at night. They come in amazing designs and colors, and their life cycles are really fascinating. The beetle on the upper left is a firefly, and yes, we do have fireflies here in Los Angeles, but it's the flightless females that glow and not the flighted males. But out of all the beetles I encounter in the garden, black-bearing beetles are by far the most interesting and fantastic. They're always covered in helpful symbiotic mites, and I could do an entire presentation on their life cycle alone. And let's give a shout out to striped skunks for a moment. When you notice that holes were dug in your yard the night before, you really should be saying thank you. Skunks have an excellent sense of smell and front claws built for digging. They snuffle around your garden searching for root-damaging grubs and dig them up to eat, preventing damage to your garden's plants and trees. This guy was coming from my next door neighbor's yard where apparently their sprinklers were on. It seems that he got his face muddy while collecting dinner. And by the way, here, scorpions can be found in our yards. And for those that don't like scorpions, skunks find them to be a delicacy. Down here, again, for scorpions, and you guys can chime in the end. I don't know if you have scorpions up there. There's a really cool tip on finding them. You can find them with an ultraviolet light because their exoskeletons glow a bluish color by absorbing the longer wavelengths in the UV spectrum, then re-emitting them in different wavelengths that are visible in the dark. Northern raccoons are just one of the many different characters utilizing our gardens at night. And sometimes when these animal paths cross, there's drama. I know this appears to be bad for the skunk, but there's no need to worry. In the end, it was the coyote that got the raw end of this encounter. I know because this was only one frame in a series of photographs. Don't you just love the look on that skunk's face? He looks scared there, but he's about to leave a lasting impression on that coyote. Now, it's always really exciting when you run across a really unique animal like this unusually patterned striped skunk. Like the leucistic hummingbird I showed you earlier, it makes this skunk very easy to identify, and I know from trail cameras that he visited the yard frequently and had been around for about 3 years. There are 2 great horned owls that have been around even longer. I've been working in the garden now for over 7 years, and they have been a bonded pair that entire time. And I know it's the same birds because their routine has stayed exactly the same year after year. The female is on the left and the male is on the right. This is true for most raptor species, the females are larger than the males. This isn't exactly to scale, but if you happen to see 2 raptors next to each other, the female's normally larger. Now, we've been hearing great horned owls frequently because the parents are staying in communication with their just fledged chicks. Great horned owls begin bonding around October, November in Southern California, and some will have eggs in their nests as early as February. These raptors don't actually build their own nests, they commandeer someone else's, like a red-tailed hawk or a common raven's nest, and they do that because they can. Another animal romance in the garden is between our male bobcat, Hank, and a young female who showed up a few years ago. I often wonder if she was attracted to his Park Service bling. In this clip, she's cheek rubbing a stump in the lower portion of the garden. Her scent will let other female bobcats know this territory is occupied, as females do not tolerate each other. But Hank, being a male, is allowed entry without any conflict. But whether you're crawling around on your own or wandering around with others, you must always stay alert and on guard, as there are constant dangers threatening wildlife, even animals as large as a deer. Yes, a mountain lion has even visited the garden. You all may be aware of P22, but he's not the only lion roaming around in the Santa Monica Mountains east of the 405 freeway. Huel, as we've affectionately named him, is an uncollared male with unknown origins. Over the past 5 years, our cameras have captured him a few times, the first being in October of 2016. But what I find most incredible about this cat is that he manages to stay virtually undetected to the residents of the neighborhoods in which he roams. And it's a testament to how these big cats really want nothing to do with human contact. Awe-inspiring encounters with mountain lions aside, our gardens are alive with special moments every day, and I encourage you to take the time to sit quietly and observe, and special moments are sure to reveal themselves. Like this adult Cooper's hawk that was drying its feathers after a morning shower. Or a flock of cedar waxwings moving north in spring. Soon, you know that fall is upon us in Los Angeles with the arrival of white-crowned sparrows as they fill the air with their delightful melodies. With patience, you might witness a minor dispute over water rights at a favorite bath. The more you tune in to the rhythms of your garden, the more wildlife will appear. That's the connection. That's how it happens. That's the zen of it. And who knows, one day you might be sitting quietly and realize that somebody is watching you. Thank you very much for letting me share some of LA's urban wildlife with you. I hope it inspires you to look into some bushes and turn over some rocks. And I gotta say, wildlife can be so rich in a native garden. If any of you are interested, I occasionally post on a blog that can be found on the Gottlieb's website, the GottliebNativeGarden.com. And for more about the garden's fauna and its history, flora and its history, you can find that in Susan Gottlieb's wonderful book, The Gottlieb Native Garden, A California Love Story. And with that, I'd like to end this and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Scott. That was amazing. The thing that strikes me is that I can't believe you've only been at this 7 years. That feels like a lifetime of incredible photographs. You're such a keen observer. Really wonderful.
What's amazing is what, you just keep peeling back the layers of the onion, just more and more appears. And I'm now, anytime I go into the garden, I'm finding new species. And last week I had a day when I found, I think, 15 new species of insects. It's incredible what life is out there.
Wow. Yeah, that is amazing. That kind of level of detail. People are starting to ask questions, but before I get to that, I just wanted to answer your question about monarchs. We do have them in Eastern Washington, but we're located in Western Washington, and it's like day. So we do get a lot of questions about milkweed selling or making it available to people, but I kind of discourage people from planting it unless we actually, the species that's native to Eastern Washington is not that showy. It's nothing. I grew up in the Midwest where they have very showy.
Right, but if monarchs aren't normally found in your area, it's not a positive thing to try to attract them there. It's better to allow them to go through their normal life cycle, yeah. And I'm in complete agreement with that. Yeah.
I think there have been a few sightings in Western Washington, but they've been one-offs, Yeah. And then we thankfully we do not have scorpions.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was like, no, but yeah, you're way too moist for scorpions.
Oh, so Martha asks, what are the most challenging invasive species in the garden, and how do you deal with them?
The most challenging invasive species that I would go directly to as a plant is mustard. Mustard down here is a nightmare, and one of this species, I don't know the actual species name, but the common name would be black mustard. And there's another mustard species that are choking out all of our native grasses down here. And they appear in the garden all the time. And the reason why that's challenging is that down here in Southern California, our soil not being disturbed is extremely important. As soon as it's disturbed, it's allowing non-native things to get into it. It sort of normally forms a crust over the top that is just absolutely full of life. both flora and fauna. As soon as you pull the weed out of it, now you've disrupted that soil, and it takes forever to get that process going again. And it's how do we deal with these invasives? And because poison's not used in the garden, it's not an option to spray an herbicide on them. So that would be the most invasive plant. When it comes to animals, the most amazing thing to me, which is just quite unbelievable, is as long as I've been there, not one animal has overrun the garden, ever. The ecosystems have built them. So this garden is about 35 years old. At least the oldest portion of it is 35 years old. The newest portion is only about a year and a half old. But in the majority of the garden, we have very rich ecosystems. And what happens is if something comes in and begins attacking a particular plant or a particular animal, there's something else in that complex web that will attack it, and so on and so on. I can use aphids, for instance. In the beginning of the season, we had an outbreak of a particular aphid species on our black oaks. Black oaks lose their leaves during the winter, and then they bud in spring. Well, on those buds, they were covered with aphids, and the groundskeepers were very worried about that. But I immediately saw that parasitic wasps were beginning to attack them. We have these aphid wasps here. And literally within a week, two weeks maximum, that was totally out of control. And within another week after that, it was done. It was over. And the tree budded out and everything was perfect. So the ecosystem has just taken care of every single outbreak that's ever happened in this garden. And it's incredible, but it's true.
That's a remarkable story. I think we have a similar thing happening with tent caterpillars, where the non-native plants that are already kind of stressed because of trying to grow them in a place where they're really not adapted to our climate, can succumb to tent caterpillar outbreaks. But the native plants just take it in stride and, leaf out again in August or choose to skip a year. So
right, they evolved with it and they know how to deal with it. The other thing that I find is that if you have a non-native sort of someone's yard or whatever it is, that's very non-native, and you find an invasive pest or an invasive pest finds that garden, finds a particular plant family it can feed on, you're not going to have the balance of predators for that, because the native predators are not going to be in that non-native garden in the first place, because they don't know what to do there. They don't think that those animals should be there. It's so amazing how, so on the insect level, these plants, they're releasing chemical markers, and the insects are actually following those chemical markers in the air to those plants. But like take birds, for instance, they recognize certain plants and they know, oh, well, that plant supports these particular insects at this particular time. And so when a garden is very native, you have a lot of these helper insects and animals already there waiting to attack an outbreak of something else. Where in a non-native garden, you just don't have that happening.
Interesting. Roxy asked a question that I think is a lot of us are probably quite envious of your job. I'm sure it has parts of it that are not so fun, but gosh, I feel
lucky. I have
to say. So she asks, what's the most challenging parts of your job?
The most challenging part of the job is species ID. So the way I do it is I photograph the majority of the things that I find, but over the years I realize which insects I need to collect, and I have my people biologists and scientists who study particular insects or families of insects, and I will send those to them for species ID. Well, cataloging all of those and figuring out the species and keeping it all straight is definitely the most challenging thing for me. We've found, I think I have 6 or 7 never described insects ever that I've found in the garden. And that's a challenge because to get those described, we need to collect more species. They have to be really well documented. But we also have insects in the garden that have never been discovered in North America. Just recently, we had a parasitic wasp that its family lives in South America. Never had one of those been discovered in North America. So what is that all saying? A lot of people say, oh, well, that's climate change and this and that, but I don't think so. What it is that, there are so many, probably millions of insects that have never been discovered yet. And it's only because people haven't found them yet. I mean, you may have seen them in your garden, but you don't think twice about it because it's just there. But when you start documenting it, you start realizing, oh, there's stuff for discovery. My background is I got into birds as a child, and I was a birder basically most of my life. Obviously, the holy grail would be finding something new or a new species, and occasionally new species of birds are found, every 10, 15 years in very remote places. You can go in your yard and find a new species of insect. And I find that extremely fun and interesting, that we as just citizen science can just find a new species. So so it's a species identification I find the most challenging. But it's fun. I mean, it's challenging, but it's fun. The way I look at it is that the garden is the ecosystem is a giant puzzle. And the first thing I have to do is figure out what the puzzle piece looks like. And then after finding that puzzle piece, where it fits into the ecosystem.
Yeah, you had interesting stories about the life history of some of these insects, and that must be fascinating to research that.
It is. It is. And it's also so interesting to me how many times removed insects are interacting with each other. It just goes on and on and on. You look at one insect in your garden, but that one insect is part of maybe a dozen insects' life cycles. And that just becomes so rich and complicated. And that's where a healthy ecosystem really, really comes in.
Mm-hmm. Janice asked if you have rats in the garden, and if so, do the owls or the snakes get them?
Yes. So we have 2 species of rats in the garden. Both of them are native to our area of Los Angeles. There are 2 very invasive rats here in Los Angeles, but they're normally found in sort of much more urban settings or in the city. I grew up in Hollywood, and there we had both the Norway rat and the black rat, and they're nasty. But our native rats here are really cute. In fact, the big-eared wood rat, which is the most common rat we have in the garden, that's what Mickey Mouse is actually penciled after. It's a cute rat and with a fully, furred tail. We also, I think I've found 4 different mice species in the garden too. But they were getting eaten. Everyone's feeding each other. Everyone's keeping each other in control. And it's like we can find a lot of things that people would consider bad for their garden or consider, we got to get rid of this. But those things never get out of control here because there's a predator who will always jump on that population. Just as I was talking about, like the bobcats. The one thing population always grows enormous this time of year, and it's enormous right now, are our ground squirrels, because they breed in early spring. And then all of a sudden, where you have, 6 or 7 females, each one of them has a litter of 15 pups or something. It's incredible how that population grows. But the bobcats know that. And the bobcats are fantastic ground squirrel hunters. And wildlife is always attracted to the easiest source of food. Well, the easiest source of food in the garden right now are these ground squirrels, and the bobcats are here, and they're going to cull them back down again. So it just everything keeps itself in balance.
Do you have mountain beaver down there?
What? No, what is that?
It's a Apelodontia. It's a burrowing rodent that kind of, people don't appreciate them when they move into their, I'm thinking the hillside, and I think they like the kind of type of landscape I see in your garden, that it's, on a slope, and they burrow in and eat.
So that would be
the trees, and
that would be the California ground squirrels for us. So California ground squirrels are always associated. Well, I won't say always, but for the majority are associated with hillsides, and they dig their underground condominiums and cities. Now, if you look at that on an ecological side, that's very important because they're keeping the ground irrigated, they're moving soil around, they're bringing nutrients up and down, and so on, blah blah blah. But yes, they can eat a lot, and they can cause damage. And they do cause damage in the garden. But as you can see from the photograph, you see this photograph behind me, these things are eating some portions of the garden, but they're not overrunning the garden. So it's okay, it's fine. It's like, very, very rarely does a net have to be put. Well, here, I'll give a great, for instance. One of the biggest problems that people have living in the foothills of Los Angeles are deer. They hate deer because they're huge. They can mow down your garden in one evening. They love roses. They love, these super exotic flowers. and they go in and they destroy everyone's gardens. Deer are in this garden all the time, and they don't do anything to it. Why? Because this is the palette that they normally have. They can just get wherever they walk, they can get this. But when they go into a non-native garden and they have roses, they're just in heaven. I mean, they're like, oh my God, they love it, right? So it's like the garden itself is never going to get mowed down by deer because they have all this everywhere they go normally anyway. They're looking for exotic stuff. In the foothills of LA, they definitely are. So yeah, stuff is eating this garden, but it's just not, you can barely tell.
Deer, damage done by deer is a huge issue with gardeners here, and just trying to get something established. So, in the early stages of a garden, it can be
That is
vulnerable.
true.
Yeah. So
Right.
that brings me to Martha's other question was, what was there before the garden? And was the garden planned or planted, or was it developed from existing native vegetation?
Those are excellent questions. So the owner of the garden, Susan Gottlieb, her and her husband bought this property like 36, 37 years ago, and they like to travel throughout California bird watching, and we have a particular lakes, Owens Lake and Mono Lake here in the Mojave Desert. Very important landing areas for migratory birds because these lakes create billions and billions of these brine flies. So they fatten up before they continue their trip north and south. Well, LA gets their water from there, and LA had been draining these lakes. And so Susan thought, well, I want to do my little part and get rid of my exotic plantings and plant like Mediterranean non-water loving plants. The yard itself was basically ivy and bougainvillea and oleander and pyracantha. So many of the yards you see around here are those plants. And as she began to tear them out, she put in this Mediterranean habitat. But what she realized right away is that the wildlife could care less about it. And that was the beginning of her connection between native plants and wildlife. Was, oh, I can plant plants that are drought tolerant and don't need as much water and will grow better here, but will also give something to wildlife. And that began her journey to planting native plants. So going into it, she knew nothing about native plants. She knew nothing about mapping out the garden. The garden has just organically become what it is today. And I think that is a very important lesson because she never forced to try to keep a plant growing where it didn't want to grow. So if she had some plants that she planted and one is growing well and another's not, the one that's not was immediately removed and put somewhere else. It was just a trial and error. And especially, but California is a very diverse state when it comes to its plant life. We have water-loving plants and we have plants that never see water. Well, you have to know where those plants are from and which ones should be next to each other so that as the water is going down in that part of the garden, that all those plants are being healthy. But the garden itself today just sort of happened organically, yeah.
Did anybody else have a question? We could answer a few more if anybody has one. Lots of, very inspiring, and thank yous for this. Oh, Janet Kowalski has one. I don't know how to see if I can make it possible for you to just ask it, Janet. I don't know that I have the power to, sorry.
Let's see. I can do that.
Denise. So Janet Kowalski had a question. Yeah. So Janet, you could unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm a master gardener here in Skagit County, and I've been teaching a class about right plant, right place. And we've come up with a set of statewide priorities to try to teach the community to have a more locally compatible garden. And one of our priorities is to be wildfire resistant. However, some of our natives are, they're best served by a burn system.
Right.
So as somebody who teaches this class, I mean, do you have any insights for me on how I might deal with that?
That's a struggle here too, because well, that's kind of there's two parts to that down here. One is wildfires are always a threat, you know, especially in the foothills around Los Angeles. So people want to keep a defensible space between their property or their home and, you know, where the wildfire might travel through the hills. Now, our plants begin to die out, well, not die out, but go dormant, or they change as we get into the summer and they become flammable. So it's a matter of trying to, I guess, keep some of those plants away from your property, but you know, doing it in such a way that it doesn't look like a fire break. And that's the thing that's the hardest thing for people to do here. But a lot of these plants need fire. They need to be burned down to the stump periodically. And we do that in the garden, not with fire, but we just literally cut them down. So we'll cut them down and just leave the roots. Many plant species, after a few years, you know, maybe after 5-6 years, a particular plant will get topped to sort of emulate that fire cycle for those plants. So I don't know if that's really answering your question, but those are, you know, it's a tough one for us to deal with when it comes to real fires. But when it comes to the plants themselves, we're trying to create that cycle of fire by topping them.
That was helpful. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing how these, especially where we are, how these plants all evolved. Well, not all of them, but so many of them evolved for fire. And you know, we've had a couple of massive fires here in LA over the last 5-6 years. And those areas today are fully coming back. And what will happen too after a fire, after that, we get our first rains, the hillsides, they explode. And it's just amazing how these plants have adapted to fire. And you just think that would kill them, but it doesn't. And you know, there was also a previous question, something popped into my head about the getting something started. Like, it's hard to get something started. Yeah, that is definitely the hardest part. And years ago, I was encouraging them to stop cleaning out their water features. So there's nothing's put into the water, but they would always clean them out. And I said, you got to stop cleaning them out. Yeah, but we stop cleaning them out, then stuff's going to grow in them. It's like, yeah, that's exactly what we want. Well, on the front end of that, the water features were a mess, and they were, and they're going to be. And anyone who tries to do it, it's going to happen. The water feature is going to be a mess. But you can, you know, selectively pull some stuff out and selectively, you know, just sort of, you know, massage it or whatever. But what'll happen is an ecosystem will begin to happen in that water feature. And now our water features are crystal clear and have full ecosystems in them. And one thing that people say is, oh, but you know, with all these water features, aren't you worried about mosquitoes? Like, no, because there's lots of predatory insects living in those water features that eat the mosquito larvae. So, you know, no, there's no problem with mosquitoes or anything else in that water. But I will say it's painful getting it started. But once it happens, it's going forever. And that's the same in the garden, in different spaces of the garden. It is painful to get some of the ecosystems going, but as soon as they take hold, then they begin building those building blocks themselves.
Are those water features with a recirculating pump?
Yeah, they're all recirculating. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you know, for us again, mosquitoes down here are a problem in slack or in water where it's not moving, right? Well, these are all circulating water features, but 3 of them are quite large, and there's lots of areas with slack water. So that's where the mosquitoes would lay their eggs. Well, and that's where their larvae would be. Well, the stonefly and the darners and everyone else's larvae, no, that's where it is. And they just hang out and they just eat the larvae. So mosquitoes just aren't a problem at all.
Here's an interesting question. It sounds like a lot of active management of the garden. So yeah. How many people work in the garden? And
depends on the season. So, well, there's a 2-part question to that. Number one, it comes to the season. Number 2, this is a constantly viewed garden. And in fact, it's open to the public once a year. And to give you an idea of how many people view it, they had nearly 700 people in this garden 3 weeks ago, one day. So because of that, leading up to that garden tour, there were 3 people working in the garden every single day, 6 days a week for, probably 5 weeks, getting it all perfect. But because of the cycles of the garden, and because we were mentioning fire earlier, as some of these plants go dormant, they're cut back. So once we get into about July, August, there'll probably be 3 people working in the garden for a few weeks, clearing everything out. But normally from 5 days a week, there's 2 people in the garden. It's quite a monster. It's huge, and because it's viewed all the time, the owners want to keep it looking nice. Now that's part of my job there is, and I'm always butting up against the groundskeepers is that if it was up to me, I would say leave it all be and don't touch it at all, because you're removing habitat when you're removing dead plants. You're removing habitat when you're removing dead stems and things like that. And that's one of my jobs there is overwatching what they're doing. And it's kind of come to the point that the owners would rather have me give the approval that anything gets done before they ever do it now. They've really shifted into the mode of how much wildlife can this yard support. But yes, there is a lot of work done in this garden by many people.
Oh, someone asked if that's a live picture behind you, or
No.
I think I see the sun rays and wondered if
the sun hasn't moved the whole time
before or not.
Yeah, no, that's a photo. It's a photo I took.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's downtown LA right there.
Yeah.
So literally this backyard is perched over downtown LA.
Yeah. Your photography is amazing, and it was really interesting to hear how you do it. So I appreciate that aspect of it too. That
it's fun to photograph in your garden. It's fun to find these things. And for anyone who's into photography at all, I would really, really lean on them to get a macro lens for their camera.
Yeah.
Because when you start seeing these insects up close, it's mind-boggling. It really is. And it's like, why are these insects even patterned like that? Why are they even camouflaged? Why are they designed that way when they're so tiny? Well, when you think about it, in their world, they're huge, so they're trying to stay away from predators, but opening up that world with a macro lens is just so fun. It really is.
Yeah, and then the videos too. The video of
I've been there's not a lot of videos in this presentation, but there's actually a documentary is being made on this garden actually as we speak. It began, well, the idea of it began about 3 years ago, and so starting about 2 years ago, I began collecting video, and I've been videoing in there, and I've caught some really, really fabulous stuff, and that's where some of these videos in this presentation came from. I'm not normally a videographer. I'm a still photographer, but we were able to sort of switch over some of my equipment and just so I look at some of this video and I think, oh my God, this is just a little garden in Los Angeles, But yeah, the documentary is going to be really fabulous in showing, how one garden can really touch so many people, and like again down here in Los Angeles, I'm really hoping, and I kind of believe that the native plant groundswell is really building. Like people have been planting native plants here for probably 20 years, but it's more of like kind of a hippie-ish thing, or like, no one knew what they were doing, and so some yards would be disasters and other yards would look okay or whatever. But as time has gone on, everyone's been figuring it out. God, we have some gorgeous gardens here in LA, and now there's seems to be this movement, and it's just so important for our wildlife. It really, really, really is, because urban neighborhoods just wipe out swashes of wildlife. It just destroys habitat. And it's amazing that we have the ability to replace that habitat and have a beautiful garden at the same time, so.
Yeah, we're feeling that the groundswell as well to use natives more and more, for a lot of different reasons: pollinators, drought tolerance, lower maintenance, all of that. But
I think the biggest thing, so my biggest thing right now, my biggest push of trying to get people to understand is that we have to stop coddling the European honeybee. That is the worst thing for our environments right now. And I don't know how prevalent European honeybees are up in your gardens, But everybody is like, oh, save the bees, but that message is not getting out correctly. The European honeybee, as the name implies, it's non-native, and it robs resources from all of our native pollinators, and that's all the pollinators I discussed earlier. But so many of these pollinators are niche pollinators who actually evolved with these plants. So they're brilliant pollinators of these particular families of plants, where the European honeybee is just not. And I know beekeeping is interesting, and I know people do it, but it should never be done because you want to save the bees. If you want to save the bees, we were talking about native pollinators, not European honeybees.
Yeah, we've had more and more movement towards the native bumblebees here, in part because of colony collapse disorder with the honeybees, and just the pesticides and medicines that you have to use on the honeybees make it less appealing, but also harder and harder to get hives for pollination of crops. And so some farmers, actually blueberry farmers in our area, are turning to planting hedgerows of native plants because
That's
they
right.
realize that it's in the
That's
long
right.
run, the bumblebee will save them.
The bumblebees and mason bees, I mean, well, there's so many different bees that are far better pollinators. I think you mentioned earlier that you put tomato plants out. European honeybee can't even pollinate a tomato flower. It's not able to, and it's not able to pollinate any kind of gourds or any melons. They can't. There's certain bees and other bumblebees do that. So yeah, anyone who has a garden, that's another thing that I say so much, is like, if you have a garden, if you have a food garden, plant natives around that food garden, because you'll be attracting these native pollinators. And not just the native bees, there's a lot of flies that are great pollinators. You'll attract these native pollinators that will be better pollinators of your food garden than the European honeybees would be in the first place. Truly.
Yeah.
And that's the message that needs to get out. And there's all the misconception, and I used to believe this. I believed this up until 2 years ago, and I understood it, or I thought I did, is that without the European honeybee, the human race is in trouble, because we've fashioned so many of our crops, or grown so many of the crops that are pollinated by European honeybees, but that's just not true. Apparently, 19% of our crops are pollinated well by European honeybees, and then the other 81% are pollinated better by native bees. So all the data is coming out, everything's coming out. It's like, we have to stop with the European honeybee and help our native pollinators instead.
Yeah, if only they made honey.
Well, yeah, they don't. The bumblebees do, but it's such a little tiny bit of honey that I don't think any of us are going to be satisfied. But no, right, none of our other native bees do. Well, here, a very interesting fact, and this will show you what monoculture European honeybee is. I mean, I don't know how many native bees are in Washington. I'm imagining 6, 7, whatever 100 species around the world. I don't know how many. Well over 10, 15, 20,000. I don't know how many native bees. There are 7 species of honeybees in the world. Only 7, and so it's those 7 compared to the tens of thousands of native bees. But that big bumbling bee that steals all these resources to create honey is affecting our environment in a negative way.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I know I'm like raining on the bee parade, but it's just, it's like the best way to look at it down here is that everyone was planting milkweed to save monarchs. Well, we didn't know we were all planting the wrong milkweed until all of a sudden we were harming the monarchs because we were planting the wrong milkweed. And I don't need to get into the reasons what caused the problem. But once we realized that, everyone's like, oh, I get it. And they shifted, and now everyone's planting the native varieties because it made sense. What has to get out there is that we have to coddle our native pollinators and not coddle the European honeybee for very, very specific reasons and intelligent reasons.
Hear, hear.
Maybe I'm preaching to the choir, I don't know, but it's just something that we really should be thinking about.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of us talk in our programs to other gardeners about the importance of the host species for our pollinators, whether it be butterflies or moths or bees, and providing nesting habitat for the bees, native bees. So, yeah,
Yes.
I was struck. How many did you say? 38 species of bees?
Yeah, I think 38 or 39 now I have in the garden, and almost 30 of them I can get every season.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think think we've got everybody's, yeah, a lot of thank yous, a lot of inspiring, good
Cool.
ideas. So yeah,
Well-
I really, really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for letting me talk, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, yeah. We'll look for your book. Thank you so much.
All right, great.